This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast a frequent guest, or a relatively frequent guest. I think this might be your fourth visit, Joe.
I think so. That's about right.
Yeah. So we have Joseph McBride, and I think the very first time I talked to you, it was about the Coen brothers, maybe.
Yeah, that sounds right, John. Yeah, it's good to be with you again.
Thank you so much. And it was it's really fitting that we're having this conversation about your new memoir book, an interview book with Danny Peary called I Love Movies, but ...
Mm-hmm.
The ellipses. And I was and it's really interesting because this book kind of traces over a lot of as I was getting to the end, I was thinking, this is where I come in.
Yeah,
this is where I join the party.
Yeah, that's right. We sort of intersected that late stage. That's right.
What was it like for you as an interviewer, as somebody who has spent a lot of his professional career interviewing other people, to be interviewed by Daniel? What was that?
Yeah, it's a strange experience because I've been a journalist and a book author for 60 years now, I guess. And I've interviewed, I estimated a few years ago, I've interviewed about 15,000 people in my lifetime, including many, many people. And, when you work in a newspaper, you're interviewing several people a day. And when I've done my biographies of Capra, Ford, Spielberg, I interview hundreds of people for each one. And I've done so many articles and all different kinds of books. So it's strange for me now. I'm more interviewed than interviewing, and I kind of miss interviewing in a sense. I know you know how much fun it is talking to people, and I always got a big kick out of that process. It's the fun part of writing a book is going out and meeting new people and all different kinds of people. Very old people who can tell you about the world before you were born, and younger people, and it's just fascinating. I love that process. And the hard part of writing a book is when you're chained to your chair and you have to sit there and write it for 2 or 3 years. But so I'm interviewed a lot in recent years because of both the podcast, which I love. It's a great form of communication. I used to like the radio. I don't do as much radio as I used to, but radio is always very quick. You get like 3 minutes or 5 minutes or something. And podcasts, you can really have a great conversation with somebody. And so I do that. And this new book with Danny, my old friend from college days at the University of Wisconsin, is great. He interviewed me a couple times for a publication in New York where he lives, and he interviewed me about Lubitsch, and then my book Two Chairs for Hollywood, which is a collection of my short work. And he was such a comfortable guy to talk to. I mean, that's a big part of what makes a good interview is comfort. And I'm sure you get that with your guests because you're easy to talk to. And Danny, like you, he knows a lot about films, and so it's kind of you don't have to explain a lot of things or whatever. But I also said to him, please provoke me, ask me difficult questions and challenging questions and humorous questions. And so we also had some of the same experiences because we went to college together. We had at our in our film group at the University of Wisconsin in the late 60s, early 70s, we had 25 people who we called the Madison Film Mafia because 25 people went into either filmmaking or writing about films or teaching about films or, more than one. Like I've done all three. And it was quite a group of interesting people. Errol Morris was the most famous filmmaker who came out of that group. Stuart Gordon was another one, and Andrew Bergman and Larry Cohen, not the B movie director Larry Cohen, but the screenwriter Lawrence D. Cohen. So all kinds of fascinating people and film historians, Douglas Gomery, David Bordwell, many, many interesting people. Patrick McGilligan, who writes great biographies. And it was a very fertile time. And so Danny and I shared those experiences. And then one reason I wanted to work with him, I've avoided collaboration since I had not a very good experience collaborating with Mike Wellington on my John Ford critical study back in, it came out in, well, it was done in 1969 to 71. And the book turned out well, but we had a hard time working together. We could talk about that if you want. But I've avoided collaborating ever since because Mike was the guy who was very good in the short form, and he became an important film reviewer for the Chicago Tribune and the LA Times, but he wasn't good at the long haul writing a book. But Danny Perry has done 25 books, and he's done film books like cult movies and alternate Oscars, very popular, very erudite film books, and very entertaining. And he's also done books on baseball, which is my first book was on baseball. I wrote a book on baseball slang when I was a teenager. And it's called High and Inside, The Complete Guide to Baseball Slang. And Danny's done, he collaborated on biographies of great baseball players like Gil Hodges and Roger Maris. And he did a wonderful interview book called We Played the Game, where he went around and talked to dozens of great players from the 40s and 50s, the kind of guys that I used to watch. I was a baseball fanatic as a kid. And Danny, I envy him because he actually got to meet these guys and talk to them. So it was a very pleasant experience being interviewed.
I think there's one of the aspects that came through in the book, and this speaks to you and Danny, yours and Danny's interest in baseball, but also a thing that Orson Welles says in terms of teaching film, which is, you've seen enough films. I wouldn't show any films. I would teach you more about history or the classics or something.
Right.
Do you think that sort of that having that interest in other things, and we're definitely going to talk about it. You have really a deep interest in the Kennedy assassination, for instance, as well as baseball, as well as films, and and uh, and literature and what have you. It feels like that roundedness, that sort of what we used to call the Renaissance. And Renaissance man sounds a bit old-fashioned. A Renaissance intellectual or Renaissance person.
Mm.
That seems like a figure we've kind of lost a little bit.
Yeah, I guess there's a sort of specialization that's when film studies became an academic subject. I mean, I was in on the ground floor in the late 60s when we were kind of creating the field of film studies, and when I went up for tenure at San Francisco State, four leading scholars said I was one of the founders of the field of film studies. I hadn't quite thought of that, but yeah, okay. We were, Robin Wood and Andrew Saris and young guys like me and some of my friends in Madison and a lot of other good people. And but when it became an academic discipline in the 70s and it became a whole different thing. It was very theory oriented and very kind of Marxist. Actually, somebody I know, I said, I was sort of kidding. I said, you have to be a Marxist to be a film scholar. And he said, no, you have to pretend to be a Marxist. That was pretty profound. But it became a subspecies of semiology and linguistics, and theory and the kind of thing I'm not terribly interested in. I come out of journalism and Richard Corliss, the editor of Film Comment, told me in the early 70s and said, all the auteurs have gone into journalism, which I guess is kind of true. But I started in journalism in 1960. I wrote my first magazine article when I was 12 about my baseball idol, Warren Spahn, the greatest left-handed pitcher in baseball history. His son, Greg, was on my Little League baseball team, and Warren Spahn was our third base coach one night and played ball with us. And so I wrote a profile of the two of them for Catholic school magazine, a national magazine. I got $40 for it. And that made me feel like I could keep doing it. And I spent years writing articles on baseball, but I never sold one. So I didn't sell another article until 1967 when I discovered I could write about film. But I kept writing all that stuff all those years, and in 1963 started the baseball book. But I was always interested in many other things. Maybe it's because of the age that I came out of, the post-war generation, as opposed to whatever it is today. Kids, one of the problems I saw teaching film at San Francisco State got more difficult as time went on, because I found that most of our cinema students toward the end of my time there didn't even watch movies. I found that very peculiar, because why would you go into cinema school if you didn't want to watch movies? And it turned out that they mostly watch YouTube videos. They watch the short form. They don't have the patience for. I mean, it is sort of a given that they don't watch what are called old movies. Peter Bogdanovich said, "It's only in the movie world that we say old movies. We don't say old novels or old music or say old paintings." But classic films, they don't seek them out, and that's kind of a sad reflection of our loss of interest in history. And the students don't know anything about American history or world history, and so I kind of became like a covert history teacher when I was, because history is my main interest. I'd say the Kennedy assassination is my main interest in life, and American history is my passion. And I was into that before I discovered film as a subject when I got to college. And I wanted to be a novelist and a journalist. And I worked for John F. Kennedy as a volunteer in 1960. And I was going to be a politician, actually. And my mother was a political person. She was vice chairman of the Wisconsin Democratic Party and worked on the Kennedy campaign. And when he got killed, and the country the system didn't want to solve his murder, I lost interest in politics and became a writer instead. So I've always had this primary interest in other things. And I was a general assignment reporter when I was starting out for several years. Every day something different happens. You don't know what's going to happen. That's part of the fun of journalism. I'd interview the mayor of Leningrad one day, and then the next day there'd be a riot on campus, during the anti-war period, and then there'd be a shooting, or there'd be a fire, all kinds of interesting stuff, or mundane government meetings, which are actually very interesting. And like school board meetings, I used to cover those, and I put a school board meeting into Rock and Roll High School, which is a script that I co-wrote, and that scene wouldn't be in there if I hadn't been a newspaper guy covering the school board, and it's a funny scene. And so I was interested in everything. I remember when I was on the set of Bound for Glory, the Hal Ashby film, the first night they used the Steadicam in a feature film. And I didn't see them use the Steadicam, and I always wondered why not. And then I looked at the film again. I realized they shot it at the magic hour, which is, as you know from Terrence Malick, it's about, when the sun is going down about 5:15 or 5:30, you get some wonderful lighting. And they did this wonderful shot of David Carradine walking through a squatter camp. And I was inside this huge warehouse interviewing the producer, Robert Blumoff, and having dinner with him while all these hundreds of extras were getting costumed and eating. So I missed the Steadicam being used, but Haskell Wexler was shooting the film. And he was a real political guy, as you know. He made Medium Cool, and, he was a radical filmmaker. And so he and I rode back to the hotel afterwards, and I was talking to him about the political content of Bound for Glory, and he was saying, well, it's very mild. It's too mild for my taste. He said Woody Guthrie was a red, and they're afraid of talking about communism in the film, and uh, so we talked, about politics and also cinematography. And he said, "You're into everything, aren't you?" And that's true.
Mm,
So when I write biographies, especially, I pick people whose films deal with all kinds of fascinating subjects. Like John Ford dealt widely with history, American history, and other countries' histories, and World War I, World War II, Korean War, Vietnam, um, the Indian Wars, Civil War, etc. And so when you do a biography, you study all these subjects. And Spielberg, I studied the Holocaust very heavily for a year to understand Schindler's List, and I interviewed 35 Holocaust survivors. I got to know them through a group in LA, and I wanted to find out how accurate that film was. And they all said the same thing. They said it was like being back there, and that
mm,
was a high compliment to the film because it made them feel it was so believable. But they said, they all said it wasn't as violent as the real thing. And
mm,
Spielberg admitted that. He said certain things you couldn't show because the audience would run out of the theater, like Nazi soldiers throwing babies up in the air and spearing them with bayonets for fun, that kind of thing. And they also had one other criticism, which is Ray Fiennes is too handsome to play that
mm.
commandant who is his external ugliness kind of mirrored his inner ugliness, But aside from that, they thought it was very, powerful film. But also with Spielberg, I had to learn about sharks, and I had to learn about dinosaurs and UFOs and all these interesting subjects like that. And so that's the kind of thing you do when you write about film.
I think that's a trait that seems to run through the book as well as a sense of, first of all, you want you do your homework like any good reporter. You're not going to sit in a room with someone who knows more. Or well, they'll know more than you, perhaps, but at the same time, you're going to be on a good level with them so that you can sort of your BS detector can be in place, and you can also kind of ask the interesting question. And the second thing I noticed throughout the in terms of your choice of subjects and where it sort of leads you, is you always have, and I think this is really important for a writer, an argument, like a real coherent argument,
Hmm.
sometimes combative, sometimes um, but like you don't just write about Ford. You kind of rescue Ford from simple-minded dismissal.
Hmm.
You don't just write about Spielberg. You
Hmm.
argue that Spielberg requires and demands, to be taken seriously long before anybody else. Nowadays, I've reviewed a ton of books. I mean, I'd love to write a book about Spielberg,
Hmm.
but I feel that the kind of he's kind of well served now. But when you wrote
Hmm.
about him, he wasn't. He wasn't all. The very idea of doing a book about Spielberg was kind of a non-starter.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I still think we need more books on Spielberg. He's undercovered compared to like somebody like Hitchcock. Something like 50, 60 books on Hitchcock. And Spielberg, you can count them, the serious books, on the fingers of one hand still. Nigel Morris, a British scholar who wrote, I think, the best critical study of Spielberg, said that he calls me the godfather of Spielberg studies. And that's because I boldly went where no man went before. I used to think of that line from Star Wars. I mean, Star Trek.
Star
Yeah,
Trek. Oh, you're going to get killed
yeah,
now.
yeah, yeah. Well, I caught myself. But actually, there was one biography before me that was sort of okay. Tony Crawley, another English writer, did a little biography of Spielberg, but it was taken mostly from interviews with Spielberg, who gives very thoughtful interviews. He's a very
Mm,
articulate guy analyzing himself. But when the subject is the main source, you're very limited in your perspective. And I thought, well, nobody's interviewed all the other people in his life. I mean, literally nobody had. And so I interviewed something like, I don't know, 370 people. And the story that was the untold wonderful story, aside from the fact that Spielberg, I thought, was criminally neglected as a great filmmaker, was this wonderful story of this kid filmmaker. Billy Wilder said Steven Spielberg was a great director when he was 10 years old. And that's actually
Mm.
true. He started making films when he was 10 in 1957. And I interviewed all the kids who worked with him on those amateur films, the boys and the girls he grew up with, who are now, my age, because I'm Spielberg's age. And they were all really dying to talk. And a lot of them said, I've been waiting for 30 years. This is in the 90s when I did this book, for somebody to ring my doorbell or call me on the phone and say, hey, tell me about working with Stephen. Or Steve, or Stevie, as they call him. And they had great stories. And it's a wonderful tale of this self-taught kid filmmaker who actually he worked with his father, Arnold, who was neglected, and people kind of misunderstood how important his father was in his life. And he rectified that in the Fablemans. But I discovered that along the way by talking to these kids and other things. Like one guy said, I wasn't sure who was directing the film, Stephen or his father. Another kid said, I actively liked Mr. Spielberg, and I did too. I got to
Mm.
interview him, a wonderful man. And I would have loved to have interviewed Capra's parents, for example, but they were long gone. But Stephen asked his mother not to talk to me because, I was thinking at the time, well, your mother knows all the bad stuff about what's under your bed and everything. But I think he might have been. One thing I didn't know was how he discovered that his mother had the romance with Bernie Adler, which is the centerpiece of the Fablemans, where he was filming and he got this private moment. I didn't know that. That was the secret that he and his mother had. And he probably thought maybe his mother might blurt it out if I talked to her, just in
Mm.
retrospect. But I did get to his father before Stephen found out I was going to talk to him. And he was an invaluable source. He was kind of the family historian, for one thing. And just a really interesting man. He was a computer pioneer and just great. But, it was like inventing the wheel of Spielberg studies. And I did that with Capra too, because Capra's career had been completely mythically treated in the media with his connivance. He helped create this myth about himself, which bore only a tangential connection to the reality. And
This is sort of a liberal sort of New Deal
yeah,
guy who's the underdog and
yeah,
against Mr. Potter and Pottersville.
yeah. He wrote his autobiography, the name of the title, which is a very captivating kind of book, but it's as the New York Times reviewer of my book wrote, Capra's autobiography seems to have been a lie practically from start to finish. And that's literally true. About the only things I found in his autobiography that were true were the date of his birth and the date that the ship left Italy for America. But I took the precaution. I always check everything as a journalist. I got his birth certificate from Italy, and I went to Washington to get the ship's manifest from the National Archives. And those two things checked up, but nothing else did. And he also said, for example, he grew up in an Italian ghetto of Los Angeles where they all talked alike and thought alike, and he didn't like that kind of thing. But I got this census, the 1910 census at the National Archives, and I Xeroxed it. And then I started calling all these people. And I noticed in the census, they weren't all Italians. It was the whole
Mm.
range of ethnic minority people, a lot of immigrants and lower middle class people. They weren't actually that poor either. They were kind of lower middle class. They owned three houses. I mean, Um, but then I started going through the phone book and calling, trying to find all the people, and I found a lot of people who he grew up with and people who lived in the neighborhood. I went in the old neighborhood. The neighborhood was still there. It hadn't changed. It was one of the myths about LA is everything is torn down and rebuilt all the time, which is true of the wealthier parts of town, but the more humble parts of town are still there largely. And So it was like going into the Twilight Zone. His whole neighborhood was there. And I found one old man who was still living there, who had been there when Capra was there. And the first thing I did, this is kind of my journalist training. I walked in the neighborhood and I saw an Italian grocery. And I thought, well, that's a good place to start. So I walked in there and met these two brothers who were running this grocery. And they, their dad had been there before. And they told me, go see this guy. And here's this, go here. And I interviewed a lot of people who went to school with him, and it was a whole different story from his autobiography. And he was not a New Deal liberal. He was a strongly conservative Roosevelt hater,
Mm,
And
mm,
I said to him, "Why do you hate Franklin Roosevelt?" And he said, "Because he was a rich kid. I mean, he had this thing." And Claudette Colbert told me that she was at a dinner party once where they were passing around a Life magazine with pictures of Franklin Roosevelt as a boy driving a little pony cart, and he had kind of long hair like Little Lord Fauntleroy, and they all thought that was really cute. And Capra was fuming. He said, when he was doing this, I was peddling papers. She said, what a
mm,
psychiatrist could do with that, So
mm,
by talking
mm,
to these people, you get a completely different story. And then the big discovery I made was he was an informer during the blacklist period, which he had done everything to cover up. But I was the first person to look through his papers. And, I, again, with journalistic instincts, the strangest part of his autobiography is 1951, he goes to India to represent the State Department and as a kind of a strident anti-communist at this film festival, you know, American values against the Soviet bloc. And India was what they called non-aligned country at the time. And anyway, it just seemed very strident and out of keeping with the rest of the book. And so I asked for the box for 1951. And I opened the box, and within 30 minutes, I had the story because I found evidence that around that time he was informing on his colleagues to the government. And this was this he had preserved the evidence of his guilt, but it was a major story that I had. As a journalist, I thought I'm sitting on a really big story, and it was hard to get it out. It took 4 years of legal battle to get the book out. I had fierce opposition from my own publisher, Alfred A. Knopf. The famous editor Robert Gottlieb was my editor, and he turned against the book, tried to sabotage the book, as well as Capra's archivist Janine Basinger of Wesleyan University, and they were trying to either kill or neuter the book. And so it took 4 years to free the book, and I got it out. And so it's kind of a battle to be a writer, and that's one of the themes of this interview book. I love movies, but I see it as kind of a war, to tell the truth. And Jonathan Lethem, the novelist, old friend of mine, he wrote the foreword, and he said, "I have a rage for truth," is the way he put it, and that's a good phrase, I think.
yeah, that's what I was thinking while I was reading it, because there are moments where I sort of think as perhaps not as rageful as perhaps I should be, although at some points I have been enraged. There's a bit of me that sort of thinks, "Oh, come on, Joe. What Hollywood autobiography hasn't
Yeah,
been,
yeah.
a self-aggrandizing, and legendary thing." And or you mentioned Steven Spielberg, you know, changing the date of his birth in interviews and stuff, and you think, "Oh well, who hasn't done that in Hollywood?" And then you go one step further and you go, "Oh, wait a minute. Okay, he was snitching to the FBI. Oh, wait a minute. Actually, he
Mhm.
changed his date of birth so he could renege on a contract that he had legally signed." And suddenly that there's the story. People don't. There are lies and there are damned lies.
Yeah, there's that line by Balzac, which is in The Godfather, behind every great fortune, there is a great crime. And Spielberg has a great fortune. He's a billionaire and has a fabulous career. And I mostly admire him. He's a great filmmaker. But he's done a couple things that I think are reprehensible. And one of those is, it may seem trivial to change the date of your birth, but he did that to basically defraud a collaborator, the guy who financed his calling card film Amblin, which was a short film that Stephen made when he was breaking in. Nobody would look at his amateur films except one guy at Universal, Chuck Silvers, who kind of discovered him. And he said, Stephen, nobody's going to look at your movies until you make a 35 millimeter film. And so he introduced him to this fellow, Dennis Hoffman, who had a little money and he had a little studio and he wanted to be a producer and he managed a rock group and all this. He had $20,000, which in those days was pretty good little money. And Stephen got to direct his first film for Dennis, but he claimed he was underage. He had agreed to make this film, and he signed a contract saying that in exchange for Dennis investing the money in this film, Stephen would let Dennis produce a film for him later that he would direct. Dennis wanted to be a producer of a major film, And Stephen kept stalling him for years until around the time of Jaws, and Dennis began pressing him. Stephen had his lawyer tell him that he was underage when he signed the contract, and so it was invalid. So Dennis sold him Amblin and the name Amblin, which is the name of Stephen's company, for $30,000, and he never got to be a producer. And Stephen could have made him a producer on Close Encounters or whatever, and he would have been an important producer. And instead, he spent his life running a donut shop in Hollywood. It's a tragic tale. And I discovered this by, the first thing you do is journalism 101. When was the subject born, And it's real easy. Like Dennis said, how did you find this out? And I said, well, I just called the Cincinnati Board of Health and sent him $8 for his birth certificate. It's real easy. And I got it. And, and he said, could you give it to me? And I said, well, I don't, you can do it yourself. And so he sued Spielberg for $33 million and he won the lawsuit. And I don't know exactly how much he got. I think he got $1 million, but he called me from Acapulco and thanked me for making him a millionaire. But the interesting thing was, this is very human. He was actually kind of sad about this whole thing, even though I made him a millionaire. And I was thinking about it, and somebody said, well, he thought Stephen was his friend all these years, and he found out he wasn't. And, it's one of the few bad things that I found that Stephen did, But Capra's life was a constant misdemeanor, I guess you'd say, and sometimes worse than a misdemeanor. He screwed over writers regularly and all different kinds of things he was betraying his colleagues in the blacklist too. That was the major crime.
Does it for you? We've had Janine Basinger on the podcast and we've talked to her. And so just full disclosure, in terms of that. But is there, for you, I can understand sort of to some degree Frank Capra's sort of champions thinking if this is divulged too widely, it will, not smear his reputation. Well, it will alter his reputation, and it will alter people's affection for the films. They will suddenly go, okay, I can't watch this film anymore because I know the person who created it is hypocritical to some degree. Does that happen with you, or do you watch his films and see them as? I think this to some degree is also when the auteur theory sort of bites you in the ass, if you excuse my French, because if you put so much credit on one person when that one person has feet of clay, as pretty much a lot of people do, then you find yourself having to reassess the films, whereas you don't really, because other people acted in them and wrote them and shot them and composed the music for them.
Yeah, and I make an argument in the book that the writers were really the authors of these movies more than Capra. Actually, I believe in joint authorship. In the early days of the auteur theory, it was somewhat simplistic. We tended to just focus on directors. But the more you study it, and I became a screenwriter, and when you're a screenwriter, you realize that the director doesn't do it all. The writers do a lot, and they tend to get the shaft. And I mean, it is true that almost when I was in Wisconsin before I went to Hollywood, I would hear these writers complaining all the time, and I thought they were just complaining too much. And then I got to Hollywood, and I realized that it was. I told Billy Wilder, I said, back in Wisconsin, I thought Sunset Boulevard was kind of, not exactly. I mean, it was a fable about Hollywood, but I said it's like a documentary, and he said, "Well, it's a Valentine." This is the way he put it. It's pretty funny. It's a Valentine. He said every industry. He said if you make a movie about Exxon versus Texaco, he says every industry has this slush under it. He said network was out at the time. The TV industry, everything is. But one of the things that a couple of points that you brought up that I think are really important. One is I tend to write books about subjects that bother me or get me angry or upset. And John Ford was asked in 1935. 1936, somebody said, "Do you tend to make movies about subjects that bother you?" And he said, "What the hell else does a man live for?" And I feel that too. The point. A French writer said that Ford had a passion for justice, and I think I do too. I mean, it's part of my upbringing and part of my political orientation. I'm for the underdog. When I was a kid, I mean, I love movies, but I talk a lot about how I was abused and misled as a kid by the Catholic Church and by my parents and by the political system, and it was a struggle to find out the truth about things, and so I became a truth seeker, and that's my big passion: find out what's the true story of things. And part of that is rectifying an injustice that if Capra had fooled people all these years and cheated his writers out of credit and betrayed his colleagues, etc., and fooled the public into thinking he was this wonderful Gandhi-like guy. He was actually a real misanthrope. I mean, it was amazing. I interviewed him for about a year, and he was a real bigot too. I mean, he was bigoted. Any group you could mention, he would make bigoted remarks. He would blame his troubles in Hollywood on Jews, for example. I mean, he made some shocking anti-Semitic comments. And the sad thing is, when he was thriving in the 30s, he seemed to get along well with Jewish colleagues like Robert Riskin, Joe Swerling, Harry Cohn. They had a combative but productive relationship. But I think it was later when things went bad for him, he started looking for scapegoats. And he didn't like Black people. He said to me, "The only Black people I approve of are athletes and entertainers." I mean, can you believe this? And he would say bad things about Native Americans, even Italian Americans, his own people. And so he was very different from his image. But I wanted to tell the truth about him and correct the record. And John Ford, I felt both times I've written books about him, he was kind of forgotten in a sense. I mean, it seems odd now because now everybody knows that he's one of the great American filmmakers. And that's because I and Mike Wilmington and other people have written books about him over the years we felt in the late 60s, Ford was having trouble getting a film made, and people were, I would have this terrible sensation. I'd mention his name to people and there'd be that blank look on their face. You've probably heard this where you talk about Terrence Malick and you get this blank look or something from people. But John Ford, one of the greatest American artists, he's like Duke Ellington or Eugene O'Neill or Tennessee Williams, one of these great people in our culture, and people didn't know who he was. So we wanted to tell people he's a great artist and then correct the misunderstandings about him. Abraham Polanski, the blacklisted writer-director, was a good friend of mine. And I once said that Ford was conservative, and he said, "You can't just say he's conservative. He's too complex for all that. He's a mixture of conservative and liberal and radical, and all these things are Ford was full of contradictions. He was like Walt Whitman in Song of Myself. He said, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." And that's a very
Mm,
true thing about America. America is a very tempestuous, contradictory, diverse country, and it always has been. And Ford's films, vary from film to film politically to some extent, and cause confusion with people. And the reason Capra's films caused confusion was people didn't realize that he was a conservative director directing liberal writers' work, and he wasn't the sole author. But where Ford was both liberal and conservative, he was at war with himself. And Yeats had a great line. He said, "Out of the battle with other people, we make rhetoric, and out of the battle with ourselves, we make poetry." And so
mm,
I think,
mm.
see, now to get to your point about artists being difficult people, I think it goes with the territory that most artists are kind of screwed up people, and that's why they create art. It's like the oyster with the grain of sand creates the pearl. And it'd be hard to think of great artists who are not kind of difficult people. And some of them are very, very screwed up. And that, so I think this whole cancel culture thing is very limited because, it reduces people to one dimension of their complex personality. And somebody may have done some reprehensible things like Picasso, let's say, but he still was a very great painter. And Frank Capra, the interesting thing is, after 7 years of writing this book and finding out all the difficult things about him, I like his movies even more. I think now I'm still a Capra film fan. I was always a huge fan of his work, and um, I think I understand them better, and that's why I like them better. And they are contradictory to some extent. They have the sort of liberal sensibility of being for the little guy against the system, which is what Joe Swirling and Sidney Buckman and Robert Riskin brought to his work. And Capra had the vestigial feeling that he could call up of having been a kind of a struggling immigrant kid. And he grew up kind of looking down on people like who couldn't do it, couldn't rise like him. But he could still remember what it was like to be that kid, out in the street. And that comes across in his movies. He's a very great director of actors. And I think that's his number one talent. He was not a great visual stylist. I found out that Joseph Walker, his cameraman, who shot 20 of his films, was mainly responsible for the visual style of his films. And the writers were responsible for the political themes. But Capra brought a lot of humanity to the characters, and he rose above his petty prejudices when he worked with people. He loved actors, and actors are people, And so if you look at pictures of him on the set, he's got a big smile on his face, and he's making eye contact with Jean Arthur and Jimmy Stewart, and the actors pretty much loved Capra. Um, so I still like Capra's films. I don't have to dislike his films to find out the true Capra. And I just think it's more interesting to find out who these people really are and understand their complexities than to have a simple-minded, heroic worship. But there is this tendency, you alluded to, the Capra fans, a lot of people just want to think he's like the angel in It's Wonderful Life, or Jimmy Stewart's character in Wonderful Life is a complex man. But um, the real Capra view of the world is pretty dark. And
Mm.
I asked him, I said, "What do you think your best film is?" And he said, "Mr. Smith Goes to Washington." And I said, "Not It's a Wonderful Life." And that's the one he always told people was his best. And he said, "No, because Mr. Smith is bigger." He says, "It's a film about our country. It's about our political system." And I think that's true. Wonderful Life has its merits, but he cops out, in my opinion, by resorting to a supernatural solution to the world's problems, whereas Mr. Smith is a very honest film about the good and bad in the American system. Although Sidney Buckman, who wrote the script, a great screenplay, who was a member of the Communist Party when he wrote it, actually. Um, he said he always left the movie before the last 2 minutes of the movie where it had that kind of forced happy ending. He said he couldn't stand that. And, Capra put this, as somebody said, happy endings imposed by force majeure on his films. But Edith Wharton had a great line. She said, what the American public wants most is a tragedy with a happy ending. And that's what Capra gives you.
Yes.
He's so American in that sense, you know.
Oh, that is so good.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is it. That's It's a Wonderful Life because its strength comes from its tragedy and the sort of almost, the despair in Jimmy Stewart's performance,
Yeah.
and then Juju's petals. Then you have Juju's petals resolving everything.
Yeah, there was a
Um,
guy, William S. Pector, film critic, wrote a really good essay on Capra in 1962. I learned from predecessors who saw things well, and he said if you take away the angel, it's a film about a man committing suicide. It really is. I mean, the angel jumps in to save him, and that's literally a Deus ex machina, like they had in the Greek tragedies. And Douglas Sirk, in the wonderful interview book Circa and Cirque by John Halliday, he talks about the Greek tragedies. He said that they would put on these happy endings to satisfy the common spectator who wanted that kind of consolation. But for the more discriminating spectator, you could see through that and realize that the God from the machine was a mechanical device that didn't really solve the problems. And there was this insoluble problem in tragedies, and tragedy. Aristotle, in his Poetics, he writes a very interesting thing that helped guide me with looking at comedy and tragedy in some of these filmmakers' work. He said that comedy is about human vice. It's making fun of human vice. And he said tragedy is about human potential. That's kind of counterintuitive, but very profound. And he wrote this 4,000 years ago. We see a tragedy and we realize that Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have forfeited their humanity, but they had potential. A tragic hero has to have some potential that he or she forfeits by
that's
making terrible errors.
absolutely. Hamlet would have made a great king.
Yeah. Yeah, all these.
King Lear could have been wise.
Yeah, yeah, and Capra's films, two of his films actually end with suicide. The Bitter Tea of General Yen and a silent film called The Way of the Strong. The protagonist commits suicide, and Capra's films have a lot of sort of attempted suicides or quasi-suicides. And he himself was suicidal at various stages in his life. And when I was interviewing Billy Wilder, and he said, Capra tried to kill himself when his final film project fell through. And I actually had not known that. And I went and checked Capra's diaries, which I had access to. And I don't think he actually did try to kill himself, but Wilder heard this, but Capra was suicidal. He wrote an earlier version of an autobiography called Night Voices, which is this very despairing fable about himself. It's kind of Wonderful Life with Frank Capra as the main character running around Hollywood in despair, trying to get a film made, and everybody's rejecting him, including Jimmy Stewart, that rejects him. And it's a very dark story. And his friends told him, "Jesus, you can't publish this. This is not what people expect of you. Write something happy with, triumph, human spirit, blah, blah, blah." And he did that. But I see that Night Voices is coming out. It's being published in January, and it'd be interesting what people will think of reading this despairing take on Frank Capra's life by himself. But I was able to read that in his papers, and I factor all that into the story of Capra, that he was really despondent. But his solution was to write something, to write a story about it, and that kind of saved him in some way. And he saved his career. I mean, his career had gone into the toilet after World War II. He had the first 45 years of his life was a tremendous success, and the last 45 years was a great failure. And his later films are terrible. And I read all the scripts that he tried to sell in the 50s, and he couldn't get them made. And but what he did was he rewrote his life as a Frank Capra tale, and the public bought it, and it made him a hero for young people. But he lived a fraudulent story, and he realized that. And I think it's a terrible thing to be loved for what you aren't. We want
Yeah.
to be loved for who we really are, you know. And I found that Capra, I interviewed him, he unloaded to me a lot, and I think it was cathartic for him. I think he felt good about it. It was a struggle to get him to tell the truth. But what I found I had to do was he would lie to me to start with, and then I'd go and interview people who were there way back in the day, or I'd find documents, and I'd come back and say, well, you know, this lady who went to high school with you said, who knew you well and actually dated him in high school, the only person I could find who dated him in high school, she said he was a nice boy, but he was just a terrible wop, which was a shocking piece of
Mm.
bigotry. You know, wop is an awful slur for Italians. And so I went to Capra and I said, you know, he was saying high school was so wonderful. And I said, you know, I'm finding out that most people didn't know who you are. And this woman said that she said we wouldn't have anything to do with him because he was an immigrant. And he said, well, she was telling the truth, that the girls wouldn't look at me. And he said, I had funny clothes. I wore cardboard shoes, and I was a janitor at the school to help pay my
Mm.
way. And they would look down on me, and hardly anybody would befriend him, you know. And so he told me the painful story of his first high school. I remember one of my editors back at Knopf said, you know, you spend a whole chapter on his high school years. Why are you doing this? And I said, well, this is the first time that he went out into the greater American society. He grew up in this kind of, you know, immigrant struggling neighborhood, and then he went into a middle class environment, a slightly, you know, more waspish environment, and they looked down on him, and it made him bitter, you know, and fueled his rage against the world that, you know, made him want to be something. You know, he had this ferocious desire to be something, which we can admire that to some extent, you know.
In a sense, I mean, as you're talking there, and as I was reading about him in I Love Movies, but I there is a sense that I feel an identification that you have with him. I mean, you had a traumatic background in terms of your family upbringing, and you had very bad high school experience with bullying, and then you lay. I was sort of taken aback sometimes. With how open you are, but at the same time, that's entirely consistent with the fact that you're sort of demanding it of other people as well,
Right.
that they should be. So, you talk about your anorexia, you talk about the time you had to recover in a mental hospital. Um, and the thing that was most sort of shocking and disturbing was the abuse that you suffered as a child in terms of being brought up with two parents who were alcoholics and who very much um, offered to the world a vision which was much different to what they actually were as well. And this makes me feel, I don't want to be the sort of dime store Freudian here, but this makes me feel that also justifies this idea of looking at childhood experiences and looking at your first entry into the world, because what else would form a wish to see beyond the illusion, to strip away the lies, as you said about the Catholic school earlier.
Yeah, and Irving Thalberg had a great line about the movie business. He called it the business of creating illusions. And it's no coincidence that I went into the movie business. You know, I was working as a screenwriter for 10 years, 18 years actually, overall. Um, but, you know, as a kid, I learned to survive by watching television. I loved, you know, I watched everything on TV, and I went to movies all the time. And I was into baseball, which is a kind of a happier form of existence where they have rules and there are umpires on the field who
Right.
enforce the rules, you know, and it was a graceful, beautiful world that I was writing about all this, and I was writing a book, and yet at home it was this constant screaming argument going on between my two parents who were alcoholics. They were both really talented newspaper people, and the public didn't know. Yeah, I mean, they didn't know that our behind the scenes of our well-known family in Milwaukee, it was a nightmare, And but all seven of us kids have done well. We've all thrived because we made something good out of bad. Um,
Was that situation ever sort of resolved or acknowledged by your parents? Was there ever a point where they sort of said, look at we understand the damage we did, or was it?
no, no, that was part of the problem, and I kept trying. As I got older, I was trying to write about it. I wrote a book called The Broken Places, which came out in
Yeah.
2015. It's a memoir of my breakup when I was in high school. I had a psychological and physical breakdown, which actually was the best thing that ever happened to me because I got out of the house. I spent 4 months in a mental hospital. I met a girl for the first time, fell in love with this fascinating but very troubled young woman who I write about in the book. And I got out of the house. I got out of school. I got out of Vietnam because of that. I got a psychological deferment to
Yeah,
save my
not
life.
not a small
Not a
thing.
small thing.
Not a s-
I got out of the Catholic Church. I mean, it was a godsend, but I had to kind of pull myself together and make something of myself, which wasn't easy, but I did it as a writer. And the first movie I saw that really struck home with me literally was Rio Bravo. When I was a kid, I went to see it. And as I told Howard Hawks, I said, I didn't know who you were, but I went to see it because Ricky Nelson is in it. And I was a Ricky Nelson fan. And he said, I didn't know you liked music so much. And but when Dean Martin, who plays an alcoholic, he's so realistic. It's a great performance, so believable. He pours the drink back into the bottle, if you remember, when he hears the Alamo music, and he starts to kind of pull himself together with the help of John Wayne and his other friends. That really made a huge impact on me because I thought, wow, I mean, I could see my life on screen for the first time, the alcoholism and maybe somebody overcoming it. And so I was growing up kind of wanting to live in an alternate reality, I guess. I remember one thing I mentioned, I learned this in Spielberg's life. Uh, Carl Jung wrote a book called Flying Saucers in 1959, a very interesting book. And he didn't believe in flying saucers, but he said that the belief in flying saucers comes out of trauma, and usually a collective social trauma. And Spielberg, when he created Close Encounters of the Third Kind, called it a UFO Watergate. That was his idea that came out of the national trauma of the government lying to us. And that gets a bit de-emphasized in the film. But there's another psychologist who studied UFOs, and he wrote that children who are traumatized learn to disassociate in response to the trauma, and they're susceptible to alternate realities. And I thought, wow, that explains my life to some extent. I got into becoming a film fanatic, and I wanted to write movies and then write books, which is, you create your own world. And so I was disassociating, but it's a form of sanity as opposed to insanity. I mean, you could disassociate and be a crazy person, but I was fortunate to have the experience of seeing a lot of insane people. And I had this girlfriend who was insane, basically, but fascinating person. But for 2 weeks, for example, in the summer of '65, when I was dating her, she thought she was Barbara Streisand. And she would go around singing people, and I had to call her Barbara. And it was weird, but I realized I didn't want to be like that. And
Mm.
oddly enough, years later, I wrote a screenplay for Barbra Streisand, and I found it very easy to write because I'd had that experience. I didn't mention that to them because they would have thought I was crazy, that I had dated her in a sense. But actually, what I did was I saw all her movies again, and I learned how to write in her voice. I rewrote a script, which I wrote for whoever, and then rewrote it for Barbra Streisand. And she didn't wind up doing the film, but It was about the quiz show scandals. That was the whole one of my film projects that didn't get made, but it was traumatic. I had a lot of traumatic experiences in the
Yeah,
film.
I was going to ask. I was going to ask that. Yeah, and then you mentioned in the book as well. Robert Redford sort of covers similar ground in his film with Ray Fiennes
Yeah,
later in the 90s.
yeah. The one thing he misses a couple of things. It's a pretty good film. I mean, Billy Wilder told me how much he liked that film, and he said, I'll give you a copy. I'll give you my copy. And I said, no, thank you. I didn't want to. I mean, I looked at the film and I liked it, and in some ways, I think it was he did some things better than I did in my script, but he
Mm,
didn't have an important female character in this story, and I think it's
mm,
hurt by not having a love story. And in my version, and it was based on a story that some friends of mine and I wrote. The idea was that the contestant on the show, it was kind of a Capra-esque story. He's fed the answers by a woman who was the associate producer on the show, and they fall in love. And she's corrupt, but she becomes idealistic in the course of the story. And that love story was terrific. And I thought Redford's film didn't have that dimension to it. But otherwise it was a very good film. But I write the most painful part of this book, I Love Movies, but was writing about my Hollywood years because it was just, a lot of bad stuff. I mean, I actually was pretty successful if you step back and look at it. In 10 years of professional screenwriting, I wrote um, two movies that got made and one that partly got made, but one of the films became a cult classic, Rock and Roll High School. And I wrote nine TV specials or documentaries, including five American Film Institute Life Achievement Award shows, which were my best experiences in screenwriting. I got to work with all these great stars and directors, people that a youngish writer usually doesn't get to work with. And I thought our tribute to Fred Astaire that I did with George Stevens Jr., the producer and co-writer, was I'm very proud of that show, and that worked out well.
mm,
But for all those successes in 10 years, pretty good track record, I wrote, I think, about a dozen scripts that weren't filmed. And that's par for the course for screenwriters. They all have a lot of things that don't get made. But to me, when I write a book, I want to get it published, and they do get published.
mm,
I don't have unpublished books sitting around. And it was really painful. I mean, I remember thinking to myself, I felt like a woman who's had too many abortions and can't conceive anymore after
mm,
10 years of writing scripts that didn't get filmed. And some of those, I was very naive and very trusting because that's character flaw that I have, I guess. And so I was fooled by a lot of sharks in Hollywood. It's a real shark tank. And um, after a while, when I was writing this book with Danny Perry, we did it by email. I began thinking this is a chronicle of stupidity, this part of my life. So I put that into the book. I said, I really acted stupidly in so many cases, and I let myself be fooled by people, and I made so many terrible mistakes. And how could I be that dumb? And then I thought, well, my wife said to me once, well, your problem with Hollywood was you're honest. And it's a
mm,
completely dishonest business. I call it a criminal enterprise. And then I thought of there's a line in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington where Claude Rains, who's the corrupt senator, says of Jimmy Stewart, he says, this boy's honest, not stupid, you know. So if
mm.
I'm going to look at myself in a more charitable light, I think, well, okay, my honesty did me in, but I was stupid as well.
I, I think as well that I mean I've had limited experience with Hollywood in terms of that side, and I think as well there is a sense that if you don't ask, they won't give. If they can get away with like picking your brains or with looking at as much as possible before they pay for an option or before they part with any money, then they'll do
Oh
that,
yeah.
and it's entirely up to you to have or it sounds like you had a terrible agent as well. It's up to you or your agent to say, well, hang on, he's not going to work without money, and you're not working without
Yeah.
money, so why should he? And that I think, especially if we're writers and we think of ourselves maybe motivated by, by trauma or by creativity or by escapism, we don't want to, we're going to do it anyway.
Yeah.
We're all that's exploited ultimately.
Well, yeah, I mean, what you just said is actually a rule in the Writers Guild of America minimum basic agreement is if they ask you to write something like an outline or a treatment or whatever, you're supposed to get paid for it. And but I learned this the hard way. I didn't know these things going in. And so I would go in and one of the scams they do in Hollywood is a producer will call in writers and make them kind of audition and throw out ideas. And then they'll say, well, thank you very much. We're going to talk to somebody else. And then they synthesize all these ideas, for free into something. And you're not supposed to really do that. But one of the problems I had, and this is, I think, instructive for people who read this book, I hope, is that they didn't tell these things to people back in the day in the 60s. The business was very mysterious back then. There weren't books telling you, how people are expected to behave or what the rules are. You had to kind of find out by talking to people, interviewing people. And I was interviewing all the directors and people I admired, and I was working for Variety. And so I was learning the hard way by doing things and getting screwed, and also by just asking people, how do you do this and that? And but it was kind of a secret society, mysterious thing on purpose. And it was a closed system back then in the 60s. If you couldn't get a job unless your father was a cinematographer or whatever. And the only person back then who would hire new people was Roger Corman. And it's no coincidence that the first three scripts I sold were to Roger Corman, and he produced Rock and Roll High School. And he had the sense uniquely to hire all these young people who were hungry and talented. And he started the careers of everybody, Coppola and Jack Nicholson and Ron Howard, and you just go through the whole list. And Roger was a visionary, but he was real cheap too, and he cheated all of us financially. That was the downside. I mean, the Writers Guild had to go after Roger because they called me and said, you've been writing multiple drafts of 3 scripts for Roger, and you're only getting paid for. He had a scam where instead of paying $8,000 for an original script, he would pay somebody in the office $200 to talk a script. I put that in quotation marks into a tape recorder, and then some secretary would type it up, and then he'd hire a writer to rewrite it at the half price rewrite fee. So that's what I did on Rock and Roll High School. Joe Dante and Alan Arkish talked a script into a tape recorder. It was 60 pages long and it really didn't have a plot.
Talk to script that they had written, or just
well,
sort of like spitballed
a
script, an idea.
Yeah, they were spitballing. Alan wanted to make a rock and roll movie. He's a big rock fanatic, and Joe and Alan were going to make their directing debuts actually on a script that I wrote called Rock City, which was about American Bandstand and Dick Clark. And it was a pretty good little script. And Joe was going to do the story scenes, and Alan was going to do the music scenes. They were going to co-direct it. And then Dick Clark came in the office to talk to Roger about some project, and Roger came in to see the story editor, and he said, give me that script, Rock City, and he gave it to Dick Clark, who called the next day and said, I'll be very unhappy if you make this film, because he was sort of satirizing Dick Clark, exploiting teenagers, But I was considered an expert on rock and roll and teenage movies, which I thought that was kind of funny, because when I was a kid, I was into rock and roll and I watched American Bandstand, but I was not a fan of, Sam Fuller was a good friend of mine, and I asked him, what do you think of Rebel Without a Cause? He said, I hate these goddamn teenagers and their fucking problems. That's kind of how I felt, I actually had a good time in high school. It was grade school where I had a hard time, but high school I went to an all boys school, so I didn't really date girls or anything. But anyway, so I was hired to come in, and Joe and Alan's little script had no plot. It was just about kids screwing around in a high school. So they called me in on a Friday and said, if you can come up with a plot by Monday, you can write this script. So I thought of this is the way writers work. My dad was when he was 12, I'm sorry, when he was in high school, he led a student strike in 1927 at his high school, which caused national attention because it hadn't been done before. And I always thought that would make a good movie, but it's a bit tame for the 70s. And then I thought, well, when I was in Madison, some students blew up a building to protest the Vietnam War and they killed a graduate student. And I thought, well, okay, the kids will take over the school and blow it up at the end and we'll make it a surreal kind of thing. And I was thinking of Zero for Conduct and If, which are school films that have violence in them. And so I kind of blended all this together and I came in on Monday and they said, wow, that's great. Except Alan said to me, Alan Arkin, she said, well, we can't have the kids blow up the school because it'll make the kids unsympathetic. So I had to kind of figure out a way to persuade him. Roger said the whole reason I made the Rock and Roll High School is I love the ending of blowing up the school. He said it's every kid's fantasy. But
Exactly. How can that be
yeah,
unsympathetic?
well, today you couldn't make that movie, after Columbine and everything. It's
Yeah, yeah.
even then only Roger could have made that film back in the 70s. It was pretty.
Yeah, I rewatched Heathers, which features a sort of blowing up the
Mm.
school towards the end, and that post Columbine is a very it lands differently.
Yeah, it's a different world we live in. But Alan said recently there's a book on Rock and Roll High School by Stephen Armstrong. He's a good historian. It's wonderful to have a book written about a film that you co-wrote. And Alan said, well, I thought about the ending for a week and I realized it's the only possible ending for that film. And Joe's idea was right. But then he
Mm.
started lying and telling people this is so like Frank Capra and his writers. Alan said, when I was in high school, I would fantasize about blowing up the school, and that's why I came up with the ending. And I had to trick him into doing the ending partly because um, there was a film being made called Over the Edge, which is about kids in a suburb who are delinquents, and they build kind of a little recreation center to keep them under control. And the kids set fire to it at the end. And my girlfriend at the time was a reporter, and she had seen this. She had done a story about this film and hadn't come out. So I told Alan, we have to outdo Jonathan Kaplan, the director of Over the Edge, who was a former Corman director. And anybody who graduated from the Corman school into the major studios, the Corman directors hated them. And I said, we have to outdo Jonathan. We have to blow up the school and top Jonathan Kaplan. He said, yes, yes, we'll do it. We'll do it. So I kind of had to trick him. But then he began
Mm.
saying, well, I thought of the ending. And he spent 40 years lying about it. And I called him back in the 70s. I said, Alan, every time you lie about this, I'm going to go into print and say that you lied. And he kept doing it until Steve Armstrong's book came out, and then he said, "Yeah, Joe had a good ending," but then he reverted to lying about it again. He's still doing that, but so I kind of could identify with Robert Riskin and these writers who were mistreated by Capra. I mean, actually, the point I want to make here is all these bad experiences I had in Hollywood when I learned the hard way, it all fed into my three biographies of great filmmakers because
Mm.
I really understood the business in a way that I would never have done living back in Wisconsin when I had kind of abstract idea of how films are made. But I learned by talking to people, and I mentioned in the book I got friendly with the studio chief who it was a minor studio, but it was a studio, and he used to brag to me that he had started as a runner for Al Capone when he was a kid in Chicago. And then he told me things like how much it would cost to hire a hitman. And he said it depends on what page in the paper the story appears. If it's page one, he said it would be $50,000. Today, that's 285,000. He said if it's page two, it'd be 40,000. If it's page 10, it would be 20,000. If it's page 40, he said $500. And I don't know if he was kidding me or not, but the industry is so corrupt that maybe he wasn't. But I learned all this stuff, and you know, I I have no illusions left about the film industry, and so I was able
Have you
able to study these guys and really reconstruct their lives.
have you ever gone down a, and this is going to lead on to us talking about the JFK fascination, but have you ever sort of had your rage for truth lead you in the wrong direction? Have you ever had something where you've thought, oh, okay, no, uh, actually this, actually I'm on the wrong trail here, or I'm on the wrong side of this argument?
I don't think in writing books I have. I mean, for example, I wrote a book about screenwriting called Writing in Pictures. Um, it's my manual of how to write screenplays based on how I taught myself how to write screenplays. And I had a little trouble selling that because one publisher who publishes a lot of books about how-to books in the industry said it was too negative, because I
Mm,
focused a lot on the hardships that screenwriters go through and I remember once when I was going through my tough times as a screenwriter, I went back to the University of Wisconsin. I spoke to a screenwriting class and I was telling them all these horror stories. And there was this young woman afterwards who came up to me and said, I want to thank you for telling all these stories. And I said, gee, maybe I was a little too harsh. And she said, no, I want to go to Hollywood and write scripts, but I'm really glad that you told me the truth of what I'm going to face when I go out there, and then I'll be better prepared. And that's what I missed. I told my students that, when I went out there, I was completely unprepared and I didn't have the benefit of a teacher telling, watch out for this and watch out for that. And so in my book, Writing in Pictures, I warned people, but I told them, here's how you can succeed, but watch out. And so this guy turned on the book and okay, that was a handicap, but then Random House published it, and it's a successful book. But I don't think in writing books, I think I had learned all my lessons. By the time I started writing my Frank Capra biography in 1984, when I left screenwriting. Well, I'll give you an example. I did a book, Hawks on Hawks, where I interviewed Howard Hawks for 7 years. And I did that
yes.
because I wanted to learn from him about storytelling. He's a great cinematic storyteller, but he's also a fabulist and he's a big liar. He told a lot of stories that, are too good to be true, and some are true and some aren't. I checked some out. Like he said, I said, what do you tell young directors when they come to you for advice? He said, well, Friedkin was going around with my daughter, and he said to me, what do you think of the night they raided Minsky's and the Boys in the Band, his early films? And Hawk said, I think they're lousy. And Friedkin said, I'd be interested in finding out why. And Hawks said, I told him, the public doesn't want to see that kind of junk. And Friedkin said, well, what should I make? He said, make a chase picture. Make a chase picture better than anybody who's done one before. And then Hawks said, and then he went out and made the French Connection. So I interviewed Friedkin and I said, this is what Hawks said. He said, absolutely true. He said, before I met Howard Hawks, my entire body of work was masturbatory, is what he said. So
Wow.
sometimes Hawks' stories checked out, but I fault myself in the book in retrospect for not correcting enough of Hawks's tales and publishing the book that, I learned how to be less gullible, looking back on that book. And when I went into the Capra book a few years later, I wasn't going to be fooled by any false story. Everything I had to check out, and so I gave my raw transcripts to Todd McCarthy, who did a fine biography of Hawks, and Peter Bogdanovich gave him his raw transcripts. So we were both hoping that Todd would correct the record, which he does very thoroughly and
Hmm.
proves what is true and what isn't. But I should have done that. So I learned my lesson. You learn lessons, but by the time I got to the Capra book, I think I knew what I was doing, and so my books. I think I think I'm happy with all the books that I've done since then.
You get it you fall into the trap, I think, as a writer get it all the time of thinking that's too good to verify.
Yeah,
Um, I mean, I
yeah.
don't, it's if I try check it and it turns out to be wrong, I want to write it anyway.
Well,
I want to
there's
somehow, there is a way of doing that. I think you can sort of cover yourself while still getting the joy of the story.
Well, my
But
when I did the Capra book, I went to see my friend Bob Thomas, who is a veteran Hollywood biographer. He wrote King Kong, which is a wonderful biography of Harry Cohn, and a lot of other biographies. And he was the AP correspondent in Hollywood for 43 years, a wonderful man. And he gave me a list of 10 tips on how to write biographies, which were very valuable, but I, I, I disregarded some of them because I disagreed with them. And one, I said to him, what do you do, Bob, when you hear two different stories about something that are completely in opposition and you can't, what do you do then? And he said, well, pick the one that's the better story and tell that story. And I thought, no, that's not what I do. What I try to do is do more research and find out which of these two is true. But actually,
Mm.
but one thing I learned from that too, though, is sometimes you can't get the whole story and you're stuck with, like John Ford, there are different accounts of what he said as he was dying. There are two or three different versions of it from people who were there. And so I printed three different accounts of Ford's final words. It's the end of the Ford book. And I said, these are what people said. I wasn't there. And there's no tape recorder going. And but with Capra, I found out if you do the research, generally you can find out almost anything about people because there's such a paper trail on all of us. And this is before the internet and before the surveillance world we live in. But there's a tremendous amount of paperwork on Capra and documentation. And if you really were willing to do the research, you can probably find out most of what you need to know. Although there were a few things I ran up against. I couldn't find out when his first wife died, for example. I just couldn't find out. And now that the internet exists, I found out her obituary popped up, because, she was a really interesting person who I liked in retrospect, and he treated her very badly, and I tried to treat her with affection in the book. But I just, I ran out of leads about what happened to the lady, and so there are certain things that you can't find out. Like I mentioned with Spielberg, I didn't know that he discovered his mother's infidelity by making a film, but I did find out about that story. I got this story basically about she fell in love with Bernie Adler, and I got it from his friends. And
Mm.
they said that he blamed his mother for the breakup and not his father. And I got this basic story. I had to be sort of circumspect in telling the story, but one of the goals I had in doing the Spielberg book was I wanted to try to bring him and his father back together, hopefully. And they actually reconciled a couple of years after my book came out. I don't know if I had an impact on that, but it was such a big event. It was on the cover of Life magazine. He and his dad
Yeah.
became friendly, and it helped him a lot psychologically. And he stopped making movies about um, flawed father figures and started making movies about flawed mother figures again. And in
Mm.
his early films like Sugarland Express and Something Evil, he made movies about flawed mother figures. And this is when it was raw, the breakup. But his whole, the breakup of his family is his big theme. It governs his whole world, but he sees it in a more complex vein now.
Mm. Mm.
He had a good relationship with his father for the last 15 years, which I was very happy to see because he's a wonderful man.
I have a problem at the moment, and you might be able to. I mean, this touches on a couple of things in our conversation, so I'll allow myself to expand on it a little bit because I'm currently in the early stages of researching a biography on Sean Connery.
Mhm.
And as you know, Joe, because I sent you an email about it earlier. Um, and one of the problems I have with Sean Connery, and in fact, one of the rejection sort of emails I got from a publisher was stated this that he's a controversial figure because of his comments to do with domestic violence
Oh,
and hitting women.
mhm.
So this touches on sort of what do you do with that kind of information when you're writing about a figure who you admire their work and everything, and it's not even like I have to discover this. He's you can watch him on YouTube talk about it quite openly.
Yeah.
Um, and then there's a a genuine accusation on the part of Diane Salento, his first wife, that there was this act of domestic violence which occurred in Spain. In a very specific sort of, she doesn't say he was abusive generally, but she says there was this one particular time that he hit her. And you know this is and lots of his friends are all no, I can't, you know, will actually volunteer, you know, he can't, a little bit like people are doing with Johnny Depp, you know, oh, that's not the person I know, he's always been very gentle and blah blah blah, which, you know, which really doesn't mean anything, you know, someone who's a domestic, you know, perpetrates domestic violence
Um,
can project, you know, they're not doing it all the time and they're not doing it to everybody they know, so there's plenty of witnesses who will say they've not done it. So with Connery, I've got this, and of course he vehemently denied it as well. Um, but as a biographer, I think her testimony rings true. It's very specific. The
mhm,
fact that she doesn't make it more broad, the fact that she doesn't say it was, you know, this time and this time and this time, that she says it was this specific moment,
mhm,
has the ring of truth about it. Why go that, you know?
mhm.
Um,
Well,
And so,
yeah.
yeah. So, well, what's your
I
take
mean,
on
I,
this?
I feel you have to be really totally candid with what you find, the good, the bad, and the
Mm,
ugly about somebody. And every human being has done things that are reprehensible. I mean, we're all
mm,
flawed. And Capra, Helen, his first wife, I asked him about the breakup with Helen, and he started telling me how he hit her, and it was a very violent breakup, and he was just so candid about it. And it was shocking, but it's part of the story. And I mean, he treated Helen very badly. And but John Ford was a difficult man. And somebody, Spielberg, said of Ford, he was like an abusive father toward his children. The people he worked with were like his family, and he really was cruel to a lot of actors and people. Like Harry Carey Jr., a wonderful man. Um, Ford threw a rock at him, once, and he ducked and it hit Pedro Armendariz in the head. But Dobie Carey loved John Ford. He was a wonderful guy. But he said one time on Two Rode Together, Ford knelt on him because he had a drinking problem, and Ford didn't like that. And Ford knelt on his chest and broke two of his ribs. And I mean, he did terrible things, and he was really mean to John Wayne. But
oh yeah, he's a real bully to
he
Wayne,
was
which is
just
sort of like,
terrible to John Wayne. But John Wayne, could take it. I mean, he was, huge, tough guy, but he was, I mean, humiliated by Ford. Claire Trevor told me stories of Ford's abusive behavior on Stagecoach. But Wayne realized that Ford, he owed his whole career as a star and great actor to Ford. But I guess my point is you have to be frank about it. And I know that it is hard today because like Pat McGilligan wrote this quite critical biography of Clint Eastwood, and he rented Eastwood sued him partly because there were um, allegations about how Eastwood had hit his first wife, and Eastwood didn't like that in print. And Pat had to make a few changes in the book to get the book reprinted. And I mean, it is harder when you're dealing with a living subject, for one thing, when you can't libel a dead person, but you want to tell the truth, and you want to
mm,
back up your stories with facts, and I mean, I got Capper to tell me about his sex life. One night he just sort of unloaded all of his sexual problems on me, and it was quite shocking, actually, how he's sexually mutilated, he said, by a quack doctor.
mm,
But if you're going to tell the truth, Samuel Johnson, whose biography by Boswell is probably the greatest biography ever written, he said if you're going to write a panegyric, you just tell good stories about people. But if you want to write a biography, you tell the truth, and you just have to admit the flaws in somebody. And if people don't like it, that's human nature. And yeah, it's going to turn off certain people because they'll think, well, I don't want to see a Sean Connery movie because he hit Diane Chiletto or whatever. But I mean, if you look at Capra's story, are people not going to see Capra films because he beat up his wife Helen? Nobody's ever mentioned that to me, but it is a
Mm.
shocking scene in my book. But the world is people are captious in terms of. I mean, it is terrible what some of these people do to people, and a lot of artists and directors have done terrible things to people, and we examples we're giving are part of it, and it's not admirable, but it's human nature, and it's part of what you write about. And if you're going to write about a human being, as you said, when I wrote my own story here, I tried to be really frank. And Tennessee Williams, I learned this from Tennessee Williams, who I think is our greatest playwright. He said a writer should never be embarrassed. And when I wrote my book, The Broken Places, there's a stigma about mental illness, for example. It was hard for me to talk to people about that over the years. People didn't want to hear that, and it was embarrassing. And I had to get over that, and it took me 49 years to write that book off and on. Um, but that's personal revelation. And so in this book, I reveal things that are, you know, perhaps embarrassing, but I'm way beyond being embarrassed. But when you're writing about somebody else, it's not that you're embarrassed, unless you're, I guess if you're if you sort of hero worship somebody, it's hard to admit that your hero did something wrong. But when we write serious biographies like you and I do, Pat McGilligan does, you want to tell the whole truth about somebody, whether it's going to turn people off or not, because you don't want to lie to people and you don't want to give a false portrait. But unfortunately, a lot of the public want false portraits. I mean, there's a certain biographer, I won't mention his name, but he sort of specializes in cleaning up the reputations of reprehensible people in the film business because people want to hear, this guy was really not as bad as people think, or this woman was not as terrible as people think. And that sells books to some extent. But if, my Capra book is not popular with certain people because they don't want to hear the bad stories about this guy they worship. But a lot of people think, wow, thank you for writing this extremely honest book and revealing. The New York Times wrote that there's a surprise on every page, revelation on
Yeah.
every page, and it's a whole story we didn't know before. And Sean Connery, well, I'd like to know what made that guy tick, and there's a violence to his screen persona too. His James Bond character is a very cold, violent character, and the way he treats women is pretty horrible. And people like that though, and frankly, I'm not a big fan of his James Bond films because they're so brutal. I like the Roger Moore films better because it's tongue in cheek, But the public loved it when he would make misogynistic remarks or talk about violence toward women in the early Bond films, and it turned me off. But I mean, those were indelible performances. They're very, very vivid. It's I just didn't admire James Bond. Like some people think he's just a wonderful character. Like John F. Kennedy, who I've written a lot of painful stuff about his life. He helped make Bond popular because he spread the word that he was a fan of Ian Fleming's books. And it's ironic because the Bond films made, in my opinion, they made assassination acceptable, because he's an assassin.
License to Kill.
License to Kill, and the public thought, great, cool, and then Kennedy gets killed 2 years later after Dr. No comes out. And I don't like movies that glorify assassination. I'm sorry. And but I mean, I love Sean Connery, his other films, The Man Who Would Be King, and all kinds of good films. But he's a mixed bag, like every great actor is, and that's why, I mean, the great actors dig deep into the heart of darkness that we all have inside of us somewhere.
I think I'll be. I was when I was reading your book, I was thinking to myself, I'm going to have to write some more emails to Joe as I go through the process of writing about Connery, because one of the things that really occurred to me is that I've been working on directors, And I do want to write a critical biography. I don't want to just do his life because there's a very good biography of Sean Connery already in existence by Christopher Bray, which I think gets a lot of Connery right,
Hmm.
but he doesn't seem to have met a Sean Connery film he liked.
Ah,
And so he just passes over all the films as if they're just sort of like things he was doing while he was doing other stuff. And he refers to them very much by how much they made at the box office, and now he needs a hit, and this one was a flop, and this one was better, and that. And I want to think about how he developed as an actor, how he chose his roles, and that leads me to questions such as what is good film acting?
yeah.
What are, different categories of acting? And he strikes me as the lost working class actor that we don't talk about. We talk about Richard Burton and we talk about this Alan Bates, Tom Courtenay, this generation of actors, Albert Finney
Mhm.
who came from the working class. Richard Harris wasn't actually working class. He
Mm.
was actually very middle class. Um, Sean Bean, who is
Hmm.
sounds very working class.
Mhm.
Actually, his father owned the factory, so that was a little bit of a. It's a little. It's just his accent sounds very regional and therefore working class. But Connery, unlike Burton, and unlike most of those actors, didn't change his accent at
Mm.
all. He sounds as working class at the end of his career as he did at the beginning.
So did Michael Caine.
Um,
Michael Caine was um, proudly not going to change his accent or his personality. And he made the public like it. And I mean, it was that whole trend in the 60s of people who were real people. I mean, it seemed like the people we knew on the street. And I mean, Billy Wilder had a funny line. He said, it all became the guy next door. He says, shit, if I want to see the guy next door, I go next door. He said, I like those beautiful people. I'm sorry, I like beautiful people. And he said, you know, he said Al Pacino is a great actor, but I don't want to see him on the screen. I mean, that's kind of an old-fashioned point of view. As much as I love Billy Wilder, that you're really right that Connery, but some of these other people you mentioned, like Burton. I was watching a Dick Cavett show with Richard Burton, which was fascinating. He talked about
mm,
his upbringing, in the mining town and the struggles his family had and his father and everything. It was just fascinating what he came out of. Um, so this is a different kind of start. On the other hand, some of the early stars came out of rough beginnings too, but they tended to idealize it. I mean, one example, here's an interesting case. Jimmy Stewart, who I worked with 5 times, and I wrote his AFI tribute with George Stevens Jr., and I interviewed him about Capra and Ford. And Jimmy Stewart in World War II was a bomber pilot, killed a lot of people. He led
mm,
20 bombing raids against German cities. And one raid, he led 1,000 heavy bombers, and they were dropping bombs, killing people. Jimmy Stewart killed a lot of people. And Frank Capra told me the unvarnished story, and I printed this. And he told me it was too rough to say on television, but Jimmy Stewart, when he did It's a Wonderful Life, had come back from the war and he was very kind of had trouble getting back into acting. And he said he didn't think acting was a decent thing for a man to do. And so Capra said to Lionel Barrymore, who's this great old pro, he said, I think you need to talk to him about acting. Will you please talk to him? So Lionel Barrymore said, do you think it's more decent to drop bombs on people than to be an actor and give people a good time? And Jimmy Stewart said, I'll be the best damn actor you ever saw. And that convinced him. But when you look at Jimmy Stewart, you don't think of him as this mass murderer, I mean, but it was war. But I mean, I tried to talk to him many times about the war, and he would never talk about it. And partly
mm,
it's guys of that generation. My dad was in the war; he wasn't in combat, but you couldn't get them to talk about it. Men were not supposed to open up about their feelings, but very few people would admit. Sam Fuller was one of the few war veterans I met who would talk about killing people. I mean, he actually,
mm.
he's an infantryman in World War II, and he killed people, and he talked about it. He said John Milius came over to his house to talk about Apocalypse Now, and Sam gave him ideas. And And Sam said to him, Milius was a notorious, well, draft evader, I guess. I mean, he had asthma and flat feet and got out of Vietnam, which is fine. I mean, I did too, but Milius was a huge hawk and he wrote these hawkish movies. And Sam said to him, have you ever killed a man? You should. You'd like it. And, but Sam was very frank about it. But Jimmy Stewart wouldn't talk about it, and partly was, how do you put this into words? But the darkness in Jimmy Stewart. I guess the point I was going to make is similarity to Connery. That especially the post-war Stewart, he was a great actor in terms of neurotic and troubled roles like Vertigo and the Anthony Mann films, and even before the war, before he went to war. And The Shop Around the Corner, people think that's such a heartwarming Lubitsch film. He plays a very nasty, unpleasant character, in my opinion. And it kind of makes the love story palatable because he's such a prick toward Margaret Sullivan, and she's not very nice either. And Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. There's a certain violence inside Jimmy Stewart in some of those films, and that's one reason people like him. Here's the thing: Ingmar Bergman said, "What a star has is a sense of danger." He says you can't be a star unless you have a sense of danger. And I thought of Ben Johnson, who I think is a wonderful actor, great John Ford actor. He doesn't have a sense of danger in those early films. Ford tried to make him a star, and in Wagon Master and Chihuahua Ribbon, who's just so nice, so charming and wonderful. But then Ford sort of exiled him for a long time and wouldn't cast him. And then he came back, and he was a pretty nasty guy after that in films like One-Eye Jacks and The Wild Bunch. And he had a sense of danger in his later life. And that's one reason he won the Academy Award. He suddenly became kind of a star. But Sean Connery definitely has a huge sense of danger surrounding him, doesn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. I was gonna say there's a I remember the interview with Maybaum, the screenwriter. I think it's Richard Maybaum,
Yeah.
who does lots of screenwriting, and he said they put in a scene in Live and Let Die, Roger Moore's first Bond film, where uh, Roger Moore goes into sort of a black only bar in Harlem, or there's only black people in this bar, and he goes in and he sits down, and he basically says we could never have written this with Sean Connery, because Sean Connery walking into that bar, you would have just felt immediately not, oh, he's a fish out of water, or he's in danger, or it's slightly comic. He would have walked into that bar and you would have just thought he could have everyone in this bar. There's such an immediate sense and I mean I obviously I am I I've from being a child I've really liked Connery, but weirdly it was films like The Man Who Would Be King and Outland that I initially started liking Connery as a very small kid. And the Bonds, I was going to see Roger Moore at the cinema, and the Connery Bonds were on TV, so were sort of in my childish mind were less special, and it was only later that I came to really admire them. But before we run out of time, because I know that it's very late over there, I do want to talk about John F. Kennedy and the assassination, and I really thought this was a fascinating. This was there were two things that I had skepticism about going into your book and reading it. One was that you don't like a razor head, and I just think that baffles me. I think the government have got to you on that one.
Yeah.
And the second one was I'm very skeptical of conspiracy theories, partly because of the sort of QAnon and the anti-vaccination stuff that we've had in recent years, where those conspiracy theories have very high cost.
Right.
But with the JFK, the deeper I got into it and the more I read about your own investigations, one thing came out, which was this Officer Tippett investigation that you focused on just was fascinating. And I suddenly started thinking, oh my God, Joe, write a screenplay just about Officer Tippett.
Well, it is you know, this again is my search for the hidden truth. As I mentioned, I was a volunteer for JFK in 1960, and I got to meet him a couple of times and talk to him. And I met him once when he was president, and I admired him somewhat naively, but I mean, I got to know him a little bit. And uh, but then when he was killed, it was a shattering blow to my it's not that we were ever innocent, but I actually wrote a short story about his assassination 2 years before it happened. It was called "The Plot Against the Country" when I was in freshman high school class, October 1961. I wrote a short story about imagining his assassination, which was kind of puerile piece of writing. It was kind of silly. I stole the murder method from a Superman comic, and it was kind of a Cold War thing, and I was kind of indoctrinated with anti-communist sensibility at the time before I grew up. But, I was worried about his safety because I had seen him close up without security. And I was actually worried about his safety. And I was a student of the Lincoln assassination when I was a kid. And I knew that that was a conspiracy. And it's very hard to kill a president. One guy can possibly do it sometimes, but more often political assassinations are conspiracies, and conspiracies happen all the time. As you say, there are phony conspiracy theories, but then there's real conspiracies in American history. And Watergate, for example, everybody knows that was a conspiracy. Iran-Contra and Vietnam War was a kind of started as a conspiracy. Anyway, but with the Kennedy case, I want to learn what happened, just like we all do, and we know a lot about what happened actually, because many people have studied it over the years, amateur historians, because the professional historians are afraid of it. But what I began to notice was the Tippit murder, which happened 39 minutes after Kennedy was killed, um, was underexplored, and the Warren Commission didn't say much about it. And Sylvia Meagher, who wrote, I think, the best book on the assassination accessories after the fact in 1967, said Tippit was unknown and unknowable. So I thought, here's a challenge. Try to find out what happened to this guy. And Oswald was blamed for both murders. So it was very important. He was actually, I found an FBI document that said he was never even arraigned for the murder of Kennedy, only for the murder of Tippit. He was charged with both crimes, but he was charged first with the murder of Tippit, and then as a kind of afterthought, the murder of Kennedy. But the public didn't know much about Tippit. And so I got to know Penn Jones Jr., who was a small town newspaper editor in Dallas, outside Dallas, who broke a lot of stories about the assassination. He was one of the early researchers. He told me, as he was a mentor of mine, he told me and other researchers, he said, take one aspect of the case, one that hasn't been explored properly, and research the hell out of it. So I did that with the Tippit murder, and I found out all kinds of stuff. I advanced the story. It was never investigated properly by the Dallas police or the Warren Commission or the House Select Committee. And I think I found out what he was doing. It was hypothesized by some people at the very beginning that um, he was possibly sent after Oswald. Supposedly when Oswald was arrested at 1:52 p.m., the police didn't know who he was until they took him to the police station, and they had two different ID cards in his wallet, and they had to figure out who he was. Well, that's not true. They knew who he was because the police were part of the conspiracy to kill Kennedy, and they had been tracking Oswald. They had a kind of a red squad that knew who Oswald was, and the CIA and FBI had many files on Oswald, and military intelligence, knew all about Oswald. And so I found out that Tippit and another policeman named William Menzel were sent to Oak Cliff, which is a suburb of Dallas, to hunt down Oswald right after the assassination. And as early as 12:45, they were racing around Oak Cliff looking for Oswald. And they were sent to either kill him or arrest him. It's not clear which, but I think probably to kill him, because you know, if you work backwards, he was killed in the police station, on the Sunday. And I think he was supposed to have been killed in the theater right after he was arrested, but he he survived because he had the presence of mind to say, I'm not resisting arrest. I'm not resisting arrest. And there were some civilians there, so the police didn't shoot him. But I interviewed Tippett's father. Here's an example of an unknown person who never had been interviewed except by the FBI once. Mr. Tippett was 90 years old, and I drove out to East Texas, very deserted part of kind of a ghost town of East Texas, and this elderly guy, very sharp old man who was a farmer his whole life. And he told me that when Tippett was murdered, this other policeman, who I later identified as Menzel, who was the policeman assigned to that district where the shooting took place, had come to Mrs. Tippett, Marie Tippett, to explain what happened to her husband. And he said he and JD were sent to hunt down Oswald by name. They knew who he was, and they were told to go to Oak Cliff where Oswald lived and to track him down. And the policeman told Mrs. Tippett, I got into a car accident and I didn't get to the scene of the crime, and JD got there and he got killed. And he always felt guilty that JD got killed, and he said it should have been me who got killed. And but the car accident, whether it actually happened or not, I did find a record of a car accident just a few blocks from where Tippett was murdered around the same time. And Menzel was the policeman who was supposedly sent to the scene of this fender bender kind of accident. He didn't get there on time. So I found out that, yeah, it's true that Tippett was part of the plot to frame and kill Oswald, or get rid of Oswald, arrest Oswald before he was officially known to the public. And so I did all kinds of research around these events, and I interviewed, for example, Tippett was seen as a good family man. I found out he had a mistress who I interviewed, and she was very frank with me and told me all about, their relationship. And he was a philanderer, and he was overextended financially. I was trying to find out what motive he might have had for being part of this conspiracy. And he owned 2 homes, and he was working as a security guard in a diner where a lot of right-wing figures in Dallas were congregating in this diner, and that's how they got to know this man. And I spent a lot of time researching the right-wing extremist climate in Texas that helped create the assassination. The Dallas Police Department was heavily involved in it, but it was, a military plot. Penn Jones was asked once, somebody said, do you think Kennedy was killed so they could widen the war in Vietnam? And he said, shit, no. He said, they wanted to take over. And he meant the military. It was a military coup. And the fingerprints of the military are all over the assassination. And Penn Jones felt that they took over our country in 1963. And he kept saying to me, they like what they got and they ain't never going to give it back. So we see the end result. And when I did a second book on the Kennedy assassination. The first one was called Into the Nightmare, 2013, my search for the killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippett. Then I did a second one called Political Truth, the Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy. And I did that in 2021. And by then, Trump had come along. And now we have a totalitarian police state, or close to a police state in our country. And look at the attempted coup of January 6, 2021, when Trump unleashed his followers on the Capitol, and a failed coup. But then he got elected president after that, which is kind of shocking. It's very shocking that people would vote for somebody like that after he tried to overthrow the government. And so if people don't believe that coups exist, just look at what happened on January 6, 2021. I mean, I knew that it was going to be violent that day. I got up and I turned on the TV, and I was, I kind of knew. As a journalist, you can learn how to kind of predict what is going to happen if you know enough about certain things. And But then, the book became a study in how our democracy collapsed in 1963, and that led inexorably to what we're living through now. And one point I make in my books is that since 1960, all the major events in American history, the official story doesn't make any sense. Um, Vietnam, Kennedy assassination, Martin Luther King assassination, Malcolm X, Robert Kennedy, Watergate, Iran-Contra, Gulf War, 9/11, Iraq War, all these things, the official stories are absurd. And if you study them, the Warren Commission, it comes down to 8 basic proofs. They call them proofs that Oswald killed Kennedy, and they all collapse. I have a section on how you can easily disprove these proofs. Oswald told his brother the day after the assassination, he said, don't believe all this so-called evidence. And so if people don't believe in a conspiracy in the Kennedy case, just look at the evidence and see if it makes sense, and it doesn't. And then you have to start asking yourself what really happened. And we know an awful lot about it. It's a highly studied case. I asked Penn Jones in the 80s, I said, do you think the case will ever be solved? I was a little naive. He said, well, I think me and a bunch of friends basically solved it in the 1960s. And that's kind of true. I mean, Vincent Salandria was a lawyer in Philadelphia, one of the early critics of the Warren Commission, and he said it was a transparent mystery, he called it. He said it was designed to be really obvious that this was a you know, crossfire killing Kennedy in a public square with police involvement. And when Jack Ruby killed Oswald in the police station with 60 policemen surrounding him, most of the people in the world who are more, most of the world is more used to conspiracies than Americans. And they thought, well, yeah, I mean, this really stinks that something is rotten here. And so a lot of people saw it through from the early days, but there's this real block people have about recognizing that their government could have killed the president and covered it up and gotten away with it.
I just see. I mean, one of the I totally agree that there are the possibilities of conspiracies, and there are proven conspiracies, and after the fact, people come out and say, "Oh no, we would," and Tolkien Bay and very, as you say, Watergate and Iran Contra, and it goes, the list goes on and on.
Mhm.
And then there are other things where I find the appliance of Occam's razor tends to help. So something like 9/11, I just can't believe something. I believe we don't know the whole truth, but the idea that there is some, I mean, the alternate story seems to me far less credible, not necessarily than the official version, but than the version that we know so far. I think there are questions to be asked about certain buildings collapsing and all the rest of it, but I don't think that indicates, there's a lot of incompetence happening rather than I mean, if anything, Trump's accession to power and his political career kind of proves how vulnerable American institutions have been to just being taken over. There isn't some sort of secret cabal ready to sort of.
Well, yeah, I mean, you could, it's a huge topic. Obviously, 9/11, we could talk for hours about, but
Yes, I
I'll
recognize that.
just quote one thing. Gore Vidal
Okay.
said how did he put it? The smoking gun of 9/11 is that the air defense system in the United States happened to be down that day, which is kind of astonishing that we spend
Mm.
billions of dollars for air defense and somehow it failed, that day. But when you come to Trump, well, look at the Project 2025. Was it 800-page scenario they wrote? They laid out what they're going to do, and it was not. Donald Trump is sort of the front man, the pitchman, like Ronald Reagan was sort of the pitchman for the military-industrial complex. He was an amiable actor who, you know, Reagan said a profound thing once. Michael Dieber, his TV specialist, said, "Do you have to be an actor? Do you think, does it help to be an actor to be president?" Reagan said, "I don't know how you could be president without having been an actor." You know, and that's a
Mm.
really good point because the president is sort of the pitchman for the country, and Trump is like that too. He's a buffoon and he's shallow and stupid, and but he has all these devious, wily people behind him, think tanks plotting all these things, and we know the names of some of them, um, telling him what to do. You know, we don't really think that Trump is sitting there having thoughts about how, you know, who's going to screw the next day. I mean, he's told by various people what to do. That's pretty obvious. I mean, you know,
Mm.
but
Mm.
that's not unusual in the history of America. There are, you know, it's like when you talk about movie directors, if you want to tie it all together, it's not just one guy running the whole show. You know, a movie director,
Absolutely.
as Peter Bogdanovich says, you know, if you're on the set of Cheyenne Autumn and you had 800 people on the crew, it would break your heart to see him when he was dying, you know, because he saw him when he was commanding 800 people. And, you know, Ingmar Bergman said what makes a great director is having a personal vision. And yet you need all those people to execute your vision. You need screenwriters, producers, cinematographers, stuntmen, you know, all these people. And the same with the president. Kennedy and Obama said the same thing. On the first press conference when they became president, they were each asked, what's the most surprising thing you found out when you became president? And Kennedy said, how little power I actually have. And Obama said
Mm.
exactly the same thing, which is fascinating, you know, many years later. And he's a smart fellow, you know, Obama. But how little power I actually have, you know, and these guys are, you know, have this huge bureaucracy. 5 million people work for the federal government, and then you have the military industrial complex that Eisenhower warned against. Well, that's a conspiracy. Eisenhower, his farewell speech is a great speech. I urge people to watch it. And Kennedy was very impressed by that. It was 3 days before he became president. Eisenhower warned about the unwarranted influence of the military industrial complex. And it's a very prescient speech. And Eisenhower was commanding general of the Allied forces in World War II, and yet he felt he had kind of lost control of his government to some extent. And Kennedy, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the reason that was finally solved was Robert Kennedy went to see the Russian ambassador on October 27th and said, "Tell Khrushchev that my brother feels, you know, he's losing control of his government. And if we don't solve this immediately, the military may take over and have a war, and you can't stop it." And Khrushchev was told, and he immediately said, "Okay, we back off." And we wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Kennedy and Khrushchev having the wisdom to back off. But they both realized they were not totally in control, and both of them lost their jobs. Kennedy, that was one of the reasons Kennedy was killed by the military, because we thought it was a victory for America, but they thought it was a terrible defeat. They thought it was like Munich sellout.
Mm.
Kennedy had a meeting with his Joint Chiefs of Staff to thank them for helping, and they were furious. They said, "This is the worst defeat in our history, and this is terrible." And he was shocked, you know. And Khrushchev lost his job. He was deposed the following year for saving the world, those two guys. So,
Mm.
you know, conspiracies are just, all it is two people working together to do something usually illegal and usually in secret. And I mean, that's how governments tend to work, or businesses. I mean, it's not just one guy saying do this and do that. It's a group of people doing things. I guess what people don't want to admit is the criminality to it, to
Mm. Mm.
governments are criminal. But I think it's pretty obvious now if you look at our government and the Russian government, and you know, these criminal, run by criminals. And Hollywood, as I say in my book, I love movies, but is a criminal enterprise. And I didn't realize that when I went there, how crooked the whole thing is, and it's kind of bloated against the individual and the writer, and it's a struggle. And people who succeed in it, like Spielberg or Scorsese or Clint Eastwood. I mean, they're really remarkable talents to be able to control the system and get their way. And that's true of somebody like Kennedy or Eisenhower up to a point. But even those guys didn't have complete control, as they found out. And that's part of what I mean, as I say in the book, my real vocation in life is studying the Kennedy assassination. I want to understand that because it changed my whole life and the life of our country. And movies are my avocation. It's secondary interest.
Wow. Well, this conversation has been as wide-ranging. I was hoping we would be able to fit it in, and indeed, we've gone over twice the usual length. But this book truly deserves it. Fascinating as ever, Joseph. Thank you so much for talking to me.
Well, thank you, Jen. It's such a pleasure talking to you because you have such wide interest too, and we touch on so many areas and we get deeply into them. So I really appreciate it.